It was a quiet afternoon in a city full of contrasts. The downtown streets were bustling, filled with people coming and going, lost in their daily routines, while the suburbs offered an almost tangible calm. Sophie always preferred the suburbs, where life seemed less chaotic and time passed more gently. She loved walking in the local park after a long day at the bookstore, a place that served as her physical and emotional refuge. That particular day, the wind carried the fresh scent of freshly cut grass and wildflowers. The park was busier than usual, with children running among the trees and couples sitting on benches, exchanging smiles and confidences. Sophie walked at a steady pace, the sound of her footsteps blending with the distant chirping of birds. She wore a thick coat to shield herself from the late afternoon chill and carried a bag of books, her constant companions. She paused for a moment when she saw an elderly man struggling to keep his balance while holding a stack of old books. He stumbled, and the books fell to the ground, scattering along the path. Sophie didn't hesitate. In an instinctive gesture, she quickly approached to help. As she crouched down to pick up the books, she noticed the elderly man had a kind smile, though his face was lined with marks that told stories of a life full of experiences. The interaction was brief but meaningful. Sophie handed the books back to the man, who thanked her with a slight nod before continuing on his way. She stood there for a moment, reflecting on how small acts of kindness could brighten someone's day. What Sophie didn't realize was that someone had been watching her from a distance with quiet interest. Ethan was in the park that afternoon purely by chance. He had just left an exhausting meeting and decided he needed a moment to himself, away from the constant pressure of work and responsibilities. He often went unnoticed in places like that, wearing casual clothes that disguised his position as one of the most influential men in the city. But when he saw Sophie, something made him pause. He didn't know exactly what it was, but the way she moved, so natural and unassuming, caught his attention. He watched from afar as she helped the elderly man, her face softened by a genuine smile. Ethan stood there for a few more minutes before deciding to move on. He wasn't the kind of person who easily approached others, especially strangers. However, something about Sophie made him think that this wouldn't be their last encounter. Later, Sophie returned to the bookstore, where she had worked for years. The place was modest, with wooden shelves that exuded the scent of old and new books mingling together. For Sophie, the bookstore was more than just a job. It was an extension of who she was. She loved the feeling of finding the right book for each customer, as if she were sharing a piece of her own soul. That night, as she organized books on the shelves, the moment in the park lingered in her mind. It wasn't unusual for her to get lost in thought, but something about that day felt different. That same night, Ethan, in his penthouse, gazed at the city through enormous glass windows. He had everything money could buy, but he knew his life lacked something deeper. As he watched the city lights, the image of Sophie in the park came to mind. He didn't know her name or anything about her, but the memory of her selfless kindness was a striking contrast to the world of appearances and superficiality he was so accustomed to. Sophie had always believed that small gestures could make a difference in the world. Since childhood, she had been taught to value simple moments and find beauty in the most ordinary things. Her mother, a woman with a generous soul, used to say that every person carries a unique story, and Sophie had carried that lesson with her through the years. Perhaps that was why she always felt connected to the customers at the bookstore, even those who barely exchanged a few words with her. That same night, as she finished organizing a stack of hardcover books, Sophie thought of the elderly man in the park. She wondered why he had been carrying so many books alone, and imagined if any of them were classic novels, something that might bring comfort on a cold, silent night. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the bookstore door opening. A tall, elegant man entered, dressed in an impeccable black coat. He looked around, seeming momentarily lost. Sophie approached with a warm smile, though she didn't know it. This was Ethan, the same man who had watched her in the park. Ethan wasn't someone who typically visited bookstores. His world was filled with meetings, business dinners, and social engagements, where books rarely had a place. Yet something had drawn him to that place that night. He needed an excuse to break his routine, to do something different. When he stepped through the door, he felt an atmosphere that seemed to wrap around him like a comforting embrace. The bookstore had a soft glow, and the scent of wood and paper filled the air. Ethan walked over to one of the shelves and began skimming through the titles, not knowing exactly what he was looking for. Sophie observed him for a moment before asking, in a friendly manner, if he needed help finding something. Ethan looked at her and hesitated for a brief moment. He wasn't used to receiving genuine attention. Finally, he responded politely, and Sophie, with her natural ability to sense people's literary tastes, suggested a few titles she thought he might enjoy. As she explained the books, Ethan noticed the enthusiasm in her voice. It was clear Sophie wasn't just doing her job. She truly loved what she did. He listened intently, not so much for the content of what she was saying, but for the way she conveyed her passion with every word. Before leaving, Ethan purchased one of the books she recommended, a classic novel he likely would never have chosen on his own. Back in his penthouse, Ethan opened the book and began flipping through its pages, something he hadn't done in years. He couldn't stop thinking about Sophie and the different energy he had felt during their interaction. There was something about her that seemed to challenge the world he knew, a world where everything had a price and relationships were often transactions. He began to realize that the brief encounter at the bookstore had planted a seed of curiosity in his mind. For Sophie, that night ended like so many others. After closing the bookstore, she walked home, admiring the city lights and their reflections in the puddles on the sidewalks. She thought about the elegant man who had come into the store. He was different from the usual customers, but Sophie didn't dwell on it. To her, every customer was a new opportunity to share her love of books, and Ethan had been just another face in a sea of stories crossing her path. The following days passed for Sophie as usual, in a calm and comforting rhythm. The bookstore, situated on an unassuming corner of the city, always seemed to welcome a steady flow of people. Each customer had their own story, and Sophie enjoyed observing them in silence, imagining who they were and what they sought. Some people searched for adventure, others for answers, and some sought companionship within the pages of a book. It was as if each person found a piece of themselves there. One afternoon, while arranging a section dedicated to classic literature, Sophie noticed a young couple sitting in one of the store's corners. They were sharing a book of poetry, laughing softly as if sharing a secret. The sight made her smile. She didn't know why, but these small moments always filled her with a sweet melancholy, as if reminding her that love could be found in the simplest details. Meanwhile, Ethan was trying to focus on work, but his mind kept wandering. The book he had purchased at the bookstore remained on the coffee table in his penthouse, a silent reminder of something he didn't fully understand yet. He tried to rationalize what he felt when he met Sophie. Maybe it was just curiosity, something natural when encountering someone different. But there was something in the way she treated him, without any ulterior motives, that was so rare in his life, it stood out like a light in the darkness. That weekend, Ethan decided to return to the bookstore without a clear plan in mind. He told himself he wanted another book, but he knew there was something else drawing him back. When he entered, Sophie was at the counter, writing something in a notebook. She looked up when she heard the door, and for a moment, their eyes met again. Ethan wondered if she would recognize him, but Sophie simply gave him a polite smile before returning to her work. He began wandering through the shelves, trying to appear busy, though he wasn't sure what he was looking for. Sophie noticed his presence, but, as she always did, gave him space to explore. She believed people needed time to connect with books without interference. Still, every now and then, she glanced at him, trying to decipher something about him. He seemed out of place, like someone who had stumbled in by chance, but there was something in his expression that made him seem familiar. Ethan ended up picking up a random book, more as an excuse to approach the counter. When he handed the book to Sophie to ring up, he noticed his hands were slightly trembling. He was a man accustomed to handling pressure, but something about the simplicity of that interaction made him feel vulnerable. Sophie, on the other hand, noticed the details, the way he avoided looking directly at her, as if afraid she might see something he was trying to hide. That night, after closing the bookstore, Sophie stayed a little later than usual. She enjoyed soaking in the silence of the place when it was empty, as if the space had a soul of its own. Sitting in one of the reading chairs, she flipped through a book of poetry, while the rain began to gently patter against the windows. It was in these moments that she felt most connected to herself, far from the noise of the world. On the other side of the city, Ethan stared at the book he had just purchased but couldn't bring himself to open it. He felt strange, like he was in uncharted territory. He knew how to close multi-million-dollar deals and navigate interactions with influential people. But when it came to something as simple as talking to someone like Sophie, he felt lost. Still, he knew that, somehow, he needed to return to that bookstore. It wasn't just the place or the books. It was the feeling that there, he might find something missing in his life. Days passed and Ethan began showing up at the bookstore more frequently. He never stayed long but always found an excuse to buy something, whether it was a new book or even a simple bookmark. Sophie noticed the pattern but didn't comment. There was something intriguing about the elegant and reserved man. He seemed out of place in the cozy atmosphere, yet at the same time he seemed to find a kind of refuge there. One day, Ethan walked into the bookstore while Sophie was organizing the biography section. He moved through the space with the same hesitation as always, as if exploring unfamiliar territory. Sophie watched him from a distance, noticing how he ran his fingers along the spines of the books, as if trying to absorb something from their essence. She felt a pang of curiosity. Who was this man? And why did he seem so out of place, yet so drawn to this setting? Meanwhile, Ethan began to feel something different with each visit. Sophie's bookstore had an energy he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the atmosphere, but also the way she ran everything, with a care and attention that felt so rare in his world. He started to realize that the books she recommended weren't random. Each one seemed to speak directly to something he was feeling, as if she knew what he needed to hear without him ever saying a word. But even with these small connections, Ethan still felt caught between two worlds. His life was dominated by appearances and commitments that demanded a constant facade of perfection. He began to question what truly made him happy. The lavish dinners, extravagant trips, and endless meetings started to lose their luster. He realized there was no room in his routine for simple moments like the ones he found in Sophie's bookstore. On the other hand, Sophie also began to notice a change in her own routine. Even though she didn't truly know Ethan, she felt a certain familiarity whenever he was around. It wasn't something she could put into words. It was just a sense that he belonged in that space, even if his presence remained a mystery. She found herself thinking about him outside of work, wondering what the life of someone like him might be like. One evening, as she was closing the bookstore, Sophie found a small envelope on her desk. It was from Ethan. Inside was a simple note thanking her for the book recommendations and mentioning how that space had helped him find a bit of peace amidst the chaos. Sophie was touched by the message, but also intrigued. It was rare for customers to express something so personal, especially someone like him. However, as Ethan began to open himself up to this new perspective, his old life started to pull him back. During an important meeting with investors, he was reminded of his place in the world. One of the partners casually mentioned hearing about his frequent visits to a small bookstore. The insinuation that such behavior might be seen as unusual made him feel a wave of discomfort. It was as if his attempt to seek something authentic was a challenge to the role he was expected to play. Despite this, Ethan couldn't stay away. He continued returning to the bookstore, trying to balance the two worlds. For Sophie, his presence became part of her routine, but she also started noticing signs of internal conflict in his actions. He seemed to be struggling with something, and it made her wonder what was really going on in his life. While Ethan tried to find balance, Sophie was facing challenges of her own. The bookstore was beginning to experience financial difficulties, something she did everything to hide from her customers. It was a place that meant so much to her, and the thought of losing it was almost unbearable. Still, Sophie maintained her optimistic demeanor, focusing on giving her best to everyone who walked through the doors, even when she wasn't sure how she would pay the bills at the end of the month. These struggles created an even starker contrast between their realities. Ethan had resources that could completely change Sophie's life, but he also knew that offering help might be seen as an intrusion, something she might not accept. He began to wonder if there was a way to do something for her, without her knowing. At the same time, he started to realize that his connection with Sophie wasn't just about the bookstore, it was about the person she was. As Sophie did her best to keep the bookstore running, Ethan began to see how that place wasn't just a refuge for him, but also a reflection of Sophie's passion and effort. Every detail, from the carefully organized shelves to the little notes with reading recommendations she left in the aisles, showed how much of herself she had poured into it. It was a stark contrast to his own world, where everything seemed to be measured in terms of profit and efficiency. Ethan began to wonder if there was a way he could help Sophie without her noticing. He knew she was independent and proud, and any direct attempt to intervene might push her away. So, he started discreetly researching ways to support small local businesses. He came across a program that offered incentives to independent bookstores, and without Sophie knowing, he used his influence to ensure her bookstore was included. Meanwhile, Sophie continued to face her own challenges. Though she maintained an air of calm, the weight of financial struggles was beginning to take a toll on her. She spent sleepless nights searching for solutions, reviewing bills, and brainstorming ways to attract more customers. Yet no matter how difficult it became, she refused to give up. The bookstore was more than just a business to her. It was an extension of who she was. One day, while Ethan was at the bookstore, he noticed Sophie sorting through boxes at the back of the store. She seemed distracted, as if she were trying to organize something without enough space to do so. He watched from a distance, feeling a mix of admiration and concern. He wanted to say something, to offer help, but he knew it wasn't the right moment. Instead, he purchased another book, not because he needed it, but because he wanted to contribute, even in a small way. Unbeknownst to Sophie, Ethan began to spend more time thinking about her, outside the bookstore. He found himself wondering what her life was like beyond that space. He thought about the little things she did, like the way she tilted her head while reading something intriguing, or how her eyes lit up when she talked about a book she loved. These thoughts made him question why he'd never noticed such details in anyone else before. At the same time, Sophie started to notice that Ethan was becoming a constant presence in her life. It wasn't just the frequency of his visits, but also the genuine interest he seemed to have in the place and the books she recommended. She didn't know much about him, but something about his presence made her feel a sense of security she couldn't quite explain. Then one day, an unexpected event put everything into perspective. A severe storm swept through the city, causing significant damage in several areas, including Sophie's bookstore. One of the windows had shattered, and part of her inventory was damaged by water. When she arrived the next morning and saw the destruction, she felt a wave of despair. She knew she didn't have the resources to deal with the situation. Ethan, who happened to be walking down the street, saw Sophie standing at the bookstore's entrance, trying to assess the damage. He stopped immediately, feeling an urgency he had never experienced before. He knew this was the moment to act. Without hesitation, he walked in and started helping Sophie salvage whatever could be saved. He picked up books, moved boxes, and did everything he could to minimize the damage. Sophie was surprised but grateful. She hadn't expected him to stay and help, but his presence at that moment made all the difference. That night, as Sophie tried to reorganize the store and Ethan helped her, both began to realize how much their lives had intertwined, even without them noticing. Ethan felt more connected to that place and to Sophie, than he had ever felt anywhere else. And Sophie, though exhausted, felt that, in some way, she was no longer alone. But while Ethan and Sophie found solace in each other's presence, the outside world continued to exert its pressures. Ethan began receiving questions from friends and colleagues about where he was spending so much time. He tried to deflect, but he knew he couldn't keep it hidden forever. At the same time, Sophie started hearing rumors about how the bookstore had been included in a financial support program. She was grateful, but also suspicious. She wondered if there was something more going on that she didn't know about. These uncertainties began to create a subtle tension between them. Ethan wanted to tell the truth, but feared it might change how Sophie saw him. And Sophie, though unaware of the extent of Ethan's involvement, started realizing there was a lot about him she didn't know. The storm that hit the city seemed like just another fleeting event for most residents, but for Sophie, it was devastating. The bookstore, which was already struggling, now seemed even more fragile. Every water-damaged book, every misaligned shelf was a cruel reminder of how out of control things had become. Sophie looked around and felt the weight of all the work that needed to be done. But there was one thing she couldn't ignore: Ethan's constant presence. In the days following the storm, Ethan found ways to help Sophie discreetly. He showed up with repair materials, brought hot coffee, and in a gesture that left Sophie speechless, hired a maintenance service to fix the broken window. Sophie thanked him politely, but deep down, she wondered what drove Ethan to get so involved. To her, the bookstore was her life, but to him, it seemed like just a passing refuge. Ethan, on the other hand, began to feel that the bookstore was more than just a sanctuary. It was a place that connected him to something he had never experienced before. The slow, almost old-fashioned rhythm of the space forced him to slow down and notice things he usually ignored. Each time he helped Sophie, he felt he was contributing to something bigger, something that transcended his cold and calculated routine as a businessman. Despite this, Ethan also began facing challenges in his own life. His responsibilities at his company didn't lessen, and he found himself increasingly torn between two worlds. One night after the storm, while reviewing contracts in his office, Ethan glanced at the shelf where he kept the books he had bought from Sophie's bookstore. He wondered how something so simple could bring so much meaning. It was a new feeling for him, and at the same time, a confusing one. Sophie, in turn, began to notice subtle changes in her routine. Although she was used to handling everything on her own, she now had someone by her side, even if unofficially. Ethan showed up regularly, and his presence, though unexpected, was becoming a source of comfort. He didn't talk much about himself, but his actions spoke louder than any words could. Sophie knew there was something different about him, something that made him more than just a customer or acquaintance. On a particularly busy day at the bookstore, Sophie was hosting a reading event for local children. She had invited a local storyteller and prepared the space with colorful cushions and illustrated books. Although the storm had left its marks on the store, Sophie wanted to keep hosting events that brought life to the place. Ethan showed up in the middle of the event, watching from a distance as Sophie interacted with the children and their parents. He saw a side of her he had never noticed before, her genuine dedication to creating a welcoming space for everyone. After the event, as Sophie packed up the books and rearranged the space, Ethan stepped in to help without being asked. Although she was used to declining help, that day, she accepted it. There was something about the way Ethan got involved that made her feel like she wasn't alone. Even if only for a few moments. She still didn't understand why he was so present, but she chose not to question it. Days went by, and the bookstore began to recover slowly. Sophie noticed an increase in foot traffic, thanks in part to the support program that had been implemented. She still didn't know who was behind it, but she felt a quiet sense of gratitude. At the same time, she began to realize that Ethan was part of this positive change. He wasn't just someone who frequented the store. He was someone who made a difference. Meanwhile, Ethan continued to reflect on his role in Sophie's life. He knew he needed to make a decision. With each visit to the bookstore, he felt himself drifting further from the world he had always known. He began to question whether the values that had once guided his life still made sense. Sophie's simplicity and authenticity made him realize how hollow his own existence had become. But even so, he knew there was a barrier between them, a chasm created by their vastly different realities. One sunny morning, Sophie received an unexpected delivery at the bookstore, a collection of rare books she had always dreamed of acquiring, but could never afford. As she opened the box and saw the carefully selected titles, she felt a mix of surprise and emotion. She had no idea how it had happened, but somehow it felt like someone knew exactly what she needed. She looked out the window and saw Ethan standing outside, as if waiting for something. Sophie said nothing, but in that moment, something shifted within her. She began to see Ethan in a way she had never considered before. At the end of each day, as the city grew quiet and Sophie closed up the bookstore, she thought about how her life had changed since Ethan had appeared. She still didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He had become an important part of her story. The days at the bookstore continued to follow a peculiar rhythm, a blend of tranquility and urgency. Sophie realized that even amidst the challenges, there was something comforting about each new morning that began there. The aroma of old books, the soft light streaming through the newly repaired windows, and even the small interactions with loyal customers all contributed to a unique atmosphere. And then there was Ethan, whose presence had become almost natural, though it wasn't something she had expected or completely understood. One morning, while organizing the classic literature section, Sophie saw Ethan sitting near the window with an open book. He didn't seem to be reading. His eyes were fixed on a distant point beyond the street. For someone like Ethan, used to dominating meetings and controlling every detail of his professional life, that moment of introspection seemed out of place. Sophie noticed a softness in his expression, as if he were trying to find something he didn't yet fully understand. At the same time, Ethan was also undergoing a quiet transformation. The bookstore was a place where he could shed the image he had always carried. Away from corporate decisions, he allowed himself to observe, reflect, and, in a way, learn. He began to notice the little things Sophie did, like assisting a customer with a kindness that seemed genuine, or the way she organized the books with a care that revealed her love for the space. One afternoon, a new customer entered the bookstore. It was an elderly woman looking for a book to gift her grandson. Sophie eagerly helped her, suggesting children's books that could capture a child's imagination. Ethan watched the interaction from afar, impressed by the patience and warmth Sophie exuded. He found himself thinking about how he had never experienced anything like that in his world. The interactions he had were always transactional, never emotional. Sophie, on the other hand, began to notice subtle things about Ethan. Despite his polished appearance and confident demeanor, there was something in his gestures that hinted at vulnerability. When he helped reorganize a shelf or carried boxes of books, it was as though he was trying to show he could be more than the image he projected. Sophie started to appreciate these small actions, even though she still struggled to understand his intentions. Meanwhile, the bookstore continued to recover from the storm's damage. Sophie organized a small literary bazaar over the weekend, inviting the community to participate. The event attracted more people than she had anticipated, filling the space with children, adults, and even a few curious tourists. Ethan showed up as usual, but this time he didn't stay on the sidelines. He helped set up tables, chatted with visitors, and even bought a few books to donate to a local school. After the event, Sophie stayed late to clean up. Ethan insisted on staying to help, even though she told him it wasn't necessary. As they worked side by side, the silence between them felt comfortable, almost companionable. Or, to Sophie, it was as if Ethan had become part of the bookstore's essence, an element she didn't know she needed, but one that now seemed indispensable. However, Ethan was grappling with his own internal dilemmas. His colleagues had started noticing his frequent absences, and his business partner questioned why he was stepping back from important projects. Ethan, who always had answers for everything, found himself speechless. How could he explain that a simple bookstore and a determined woman had completely shifted his perspective? The days turned into weeks, and the routine at the bookstore continued. Sophie began to feel that, despite the challenges, she was rebuilding something solid again. And Ethan, though still torn between two worlds, felt closer to discovering what truly mattered. A pivotal moment occurred on a rainy evening when Sophie decided to review the bookstore's inventory. As she flipped through an old sales ledger, she came across a note written by her father, who had founded the bookstore decades earlier. The message was simple yet profound. Books are not just stories. They are bridges to other lives. Sophie smiled, feeling a connection to her past and the strength she needed to carry on. Ethan arrived at the bookstore just then, carrying a bag of food. He looked tired, as though the weight of his decisions was starting to catch up with him. Sophie accepted the gesture without question, and they shared a simple meal right there among the shelves of books. It was a moment of quiet, but one filled with meaning. Despite the apparent tranquility, Sophie began to notice that something was changing in Ethan. He seemed more pensive, more hesitant. Although she didn't know what was on his mind, she sensed he was grappling with something significant. And though she didn't want to admit it, the idea of losing his constant presence troubled her. As the afternoon turned into evening, the bookstore, which had always felt like a peaceful haven, now seemed to carry an air of anticipation. Ethan entered the store as he always did, but there was something different about his demeanor. There was visible tension in his shoulders, a restlessness he couldn't hide. Sophie, who was arranging shelves, noticed the change immediately. She felt a weight in the air, a sense that this would be an afternoon unlike the others. Ethan approached slowly, his steps hesitant, and Sophie, unable to explain why, felt the impact of his presence more than ever. Something was about to happen, something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. She continued her work, but her movements became more automatic, as though her body understood what was coming before her mind did. He stopped in front of her, watching her for a moment longer than usual. Sophie slowly looked up, a wave of apprehension washing over her. The silence between them stretched on, but it wasn't comfortable. It was as if words were on the verge of being spoken, yet none of them felt adequate to express the complexity of what they were both feeling. Ethan then stepped away, walking to an empty chair. His gaze was distant, as though he were somewhere else, processing everything that had transpired over the past days. The truth, something he had been avoiding, was finally becoming impossible to ignore. He had tried to hide it, even deny it, but he couldn't anymore. This bookstore and Sophie had become inseparable parts of his world, and he couldn't run from it any longer. Sophie, meanwhile, felt the tension building within her. It was as though her very soul was being pulled in opposite directions. She knew Ethan was changing, but she still didn't know how to respond to it. The way he looked at her, as though trying to understand something within himself, filled her with a quiet anguish. Something was about to be revealed, but she feared that revelation might be more than she could handle. Ethan stayed there looking at the bookshelves, but not really seeing them. His thoughts were far away, but the weight of his decisions was beginning to be felt. He knew he could no longer continue living as he had before. Sophie had touched something in him, something deep that he didn't fully understand. And the more he tried to resist it, the more he found himself drawn to her and what she represented in his life. He was caught between two worlds, and that was the truth he didn't want to admit. Sophie, on the other hand, kept observing Ethan's behavior, his uncomfortable gestures, as if he was in conflict with himself. She wanted to understand, wanted to get closer to him, but she knew that for that to happen, she would also have to confront her own feelings, her own insecurities. For a long time, she had lived with the belief that she could be strong on her own, that she didn't need anyone to move forward. But Ethan had challenged that idea, and she no longer knew how to ignore it. The clock on the wall seemed louder and louder, the ticking a constant reminder that time was passing. The tension between them grew, but there were no words that could ease what they were feeling. Sophie looked at Ethan again and realized he was on the verge of a decision. He wasn't speaking, but his body was saying it all. He was about to make a choice that would change the course of their lives, but the fear of change seemed to paralyze him. The silence became unbearable. Sophie finally put down the book she was organizing and walked to the window, looking out at the street. She took a deep breath, feeling the cold night breeze seep into the space, as if the outside world contrasted with the whirlwind of emotions she felt inside herself. She knew something needed to happen, but she didn't know if she was ready to face it. Ethan stood up from where he had been sitting. His steps were soft but firm, and he slowly approached her. Without a word, he stopped beside her, looking at the same scene outside the window. There were no more anxious gestures, no more evasive glances, just the silent presence of both, sharing a moment filled with unspoken meanings. They both knew that whatever was about to happen next would change everything. The decisions they would make, the choices they would take, could no longer be undone. Sophie felt the weight of those decisions, and Ethan, though still conflicted, knew he could no longer run from himself. It was a confrontation not only with the situation, but with who he was and what he wanted to become. Time seemed to stop, but inside them something was moving, something deep. And in that shared silence, in that absolute stillness, they both understood that, even though they were in different worlds, their paths were intertwining in a way that could no longer be ignored. As the night slowly fell over the city, the air inside the bookstore seemed denser, as if the very space was waiting for something, waiting for the change that was about to happen. Ethan and Sophie were there side by side, but in completely different worlds. Sophie felt a mix of vulnerability and courage, a strange and new feeling, something she had never experienced before, but that was beginning to root deeply within her. The silence remained heavy, but not uncomfortable. On the contrary, there was a sense of silent understanding, of a mutual understanding that was forming without words. They both knew that the situation required more than just a simple response, more than a gesture or a word to alleviate the weight of the moment. They were on the brink of a change, and no word could truly capture the magnitude of it. Ethan, who was still standing next to Sophie, looked at her again, but this time there was no longer the emotional distance he had carried for all those days. His expression was softened. The signs of worry and indecision that he had always tried to hide were now visible, more than ever. He knew that, by looking at Sophie, he was leaving behind the life he had known. And this, although it frightened him, also fascinated him. Sophie, on the other hand, felt a tremor of emotion that washed over her like a wave. She knew that what was about to happen wasn't just about Ethan. It was about her too, about how she saw the world and herself. For so long she had kept her distance, protected by the cocoon of her own routine and solitude. But all of that seemed to be crumbling now, and she didn't know if she was ready for what would come next. But, looking at Ethan, something inside her told her that if it wasn't now, it would never be. The bookstore seemed to have become an intimate space, where the two of them were about to make a decision with no turning back. The place Sophie had loved for so long was now becoming the backdrop for a deep and unexpected change. What once seemed like just a bookstore, a refuge from the outside world, was now filled with a new meaning. Every shelf, every corner of that bookstore seemed to witness what was happening between them. The ticking of the clock on the wall continued marking time, but for Sophie and Ethan, the moment seemed to stretch. They were paralyzed, but at the same time immersed in a silent understanding, as if both knew the decision was in their hands, but neither knew exactly which direction to take. It was a matter of courage, and they were both on the edge. Sophie, without realizing it, began to slowly move away from Ethan, almost as if his proximity was forcing her to face something inside herself that she wasn't ready to confront. She walked over to the reading table, running her fingers across the pages of a book, but not really reading it. Every word written there seemed like a distant echo of what she was truly living. Ethan watched Sophie closely, noticing how she was reacting to the tension in the air. He didn't know what to do. He felt the urge to move closer, to speak, but something inside him held him back. The words he had formed in his mind now seemed so small in the face of the enormity of what they were living. He was standing in front of a woman who challenged him, who made him question everything he had believed to be true about himself and about life, and he didn't know if he was ready for this kind of challenge. With every passing minute, the tension grew, but in a way, it also brought them closer. Sophie felt her heart beating faster, a sense of something imminent, but she didn't know what it was. She felt like she was on the edge of a cliff, about to take a step without knowing what she would find on the other side. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but her feelings were intense, contradictory. She wanted to run, but at the same time she knew she couldn't. Something inside her was pulling her back, something she couldn't control. And then, something changed. Sophie looked at Ethan, and for the first time saw him not as the man she knew, but as someone deeply vulnerable, someone who was finally revealing his true essence. There was something powerful and, at the same time, fragile about him, something she hadn't recognized until that moment. She felt an inexplicable urge to take a step toward him, to reach for what the two of them had created without even realizing it. But at the same time, there was a silent doubt, a fear that still made her hesitate. Ethan, for his part, saw Sophie's gesture, and that was enough for him to know that, finally, something was about to change between them. He didn't know how, but he felt that the answer he had been seeking was closer than he had imagined. The connection that had grown between them, silent and strong, was finally about to manifest. He then felt a strange relief, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. They didn't need words, not anymore. They had something stronger, the silent understanding that despite everything, they were ready to move forward. The silence in the bookstore was now different, no longer tense or filled with doubts, but soft, like the dawn after a long night. Sophie and Ethan stood side by side, but now there was a visible connection between them, something that was developing slowly, but with a depth they both understood. They no longer needed words. What was between the lines, in the gestures and small exchanges of glances, spoke more than any speech could express. Sophie felt the weight she had carried for so long, the doubt about who she was and what she truly wanted, beginning to dissipate. Something in Ethan, something in his silent presence, made her realize that she wasn't alone in this journey. He too had his own battles, his own fears, and in a way, that united them in a way she had never imagined before. They were learning to open up, to trust, to leave behind the barriers they had built throughout their lives. Ethan, for his part, felt a growing peace, something he hadn't known he could find in someone. He looked at Sophie and for the first time felt a full acceptance of who she was and who he was in that moment. There was no longer any fear of what the future might bring, no more insecurity about what he was about to choose. He knew that, no matter what came next, this connection that had formed between them was real, solid, and nothing could destroy it. The night had been long, but the early morning seemed to bring a new beginning. The sky was clear, and the stars shone as if, in some way, they reflected the renewal that was happening within both of them. Sophie and Ethan were finally ready to move forward, together, no longer as two distant people, but as a unit that had learned to understand each other without words, but with an open heart. Sophie took a step forward, with a slight smile on her lips, a smile that had once been shy but now seemed more confident. She looked at Ethan, and he looked at her with a gaze that conveyed something stronger than words could say. They no longer needed explanations, nor apologies. What was between them now was more than the fear or doubts they had experienced before. Ethan also took a step toward her, and in that movement, It seemed as if the world around them slowed down. The lights of the city, through the bookstore window, flickered like little points of hope, and in that moment, it felt like the future was no longer something to fear, but something to embrace. He took Sophie's hand with a gentle firmness, and for the first time, she felt that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Life awaited them with all its uncertainties, but together, Sophie and Ethan knew they would face any challenge. They had learned that the true value of life was not in perfection, but in shared imperfections, in the stories of two hearts that had finally met and understood that, in the end, love was what truly mattered. They moved a little closer, not out of impulse, but by choice. It was the moment they both needed to confirm that, despite all the adversities, they were ready to build something new. The past, with all its insecurities and fears, was no longer a burden. They now had the present, and with it, the chance for a future. As time continued to pass outside, inside the bookstore, Sophie reflected on everything that had happened. Love, she thought, was not about perfection or wealth. It wasn't about finding someone who had all the answers or lived without flaws. Love, to her, was about vulnerability and growth. It was about finding someone willing to walk beside her, someone who would accept her with all her imperfections and fears, someone who was ready to face the difficulties, not as obstacles to be overcome alone, but as challenges that would be easier to handle when shared. And with Ethan, she knew the journey would be easier, lighter. He didn't make her feel like she needed to be perfect, but as if she were enough. He accepted her vulnerability, just as she had accepted his. Together they had discovered that true love wasn't about what was possessed, but about what was shared. And what they shared now was something greater than words could express. The future, with its uncertainties, seemed less intimidating now. Sophie knew that love wasn't a promise of perfection, but a promise to be present, to support, to grow together. The journey wouldn't be easy, but she was willing to live it. And with Ethan by her side, she knew she could face any challenge. After all, true love doesn't need explanations, just trust, and two hearts willing to walk together, hand in hand, through life.